My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this committee. Today we are hosting a public hearing on Bill 3, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act. Today's meeting is hybrid, with some attending via Zoom and others in person. It is also being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. As a standing committee, it is our role to review any legislation introduced in the House. The committee review stage provides stakeholders and the public with an opportunity to provide their opinions on whether they support the bill or not. This process allows the public to suggest changes for committee to consider by bringing forward amendments they think may help improve the bill. Committee is also accepting input from the public in the form of written submissions. Please refer to the Legislative Assembly website for more information. That's at www.ntassembly.ca. Committee considers all concerns brought forward when determining how best to proceed. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to please direct all comments and questions to myself as chair. This helps keep the meeting organized and running smoothly. Please wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I will now ask members to introduce themselves. I'll start with Mr. Hawkins.
Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Centre. Thank you.
Danny McNeely, MLA for the Sawtooth. Thank you.
Richard Jerk, MLA for Trinity.
Denny Rogers, MLA Nuvik Boot Lake.
Okay, thank you. I will now invite MLA Testart, sponsor of this bill, to proceed with opening remarks. If you'd like to come forward, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, colleagues. I am pleased to be here today to present on Bill 3, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act, to the Standing Committee on Government Operations. This bill will amend the Petroleum Products and Carbon Tax Act to remove the statutory authority for the Government of the Northwest Territories to raise carbon taxes, while preserving the ability for the Minister to create rebate programs for low carbon grants to businesses. While complex in form, the principle of this bill is simple: to repeal the NWT carbon tax. The history of our carbon pricing regime has been divisive, to say the least, with two separate assemblies making it clear that the GNWT approach to the carbon tax has not been collaborative, puts the greatest burden on taxpayers with few low carbon alternatives available to them, and both acts were passed with slim majorities in the House. The stated position of the current government, and past governments as well, has long been that carbon pricing has been forced on the NWT, and Premier Simpson has maintained that position with this new government. Yet despite rejecting carbon pricing, it is our government that has imposed the tax on Northerners, not Ottawa. There is no federal carbon tax in the NWT. Furthermore, the GNWT cannot demonstrate any meaningful reductions in carbon emissions because of carbon pricing. British Columbia has had a carbon tax since 2008, long before the federally mandated tax, and has cut emissions between 5 and 15%. Without awareness of how the NWT carbon tax is impacting climate change policies, this tax becomes a means of generating revenue rather than a tool in the fight against climate change. Any Northerner watching news coverage of the April 1st carbon tax increase would have seen reporting that the NWT is exempt from the federal system and the increase that system incurred in the majority of the country. As we're one of 3 provinces and territories that maintain our own system independent of the federal system. Yet, Northerners know this is not the case. The GNWT carbon tax was increased on April 1st, along with the federal tax. This confusion is exactly what Bill 3 seeks to correct, by placing the responsibility for collecting carbon taxes squarely on the shoulders of the Prime Minister and the federal government. Before bringing this bill to the floor, I brought my intentions to both the Premier and the Finance Minister. Through these conversations, it became clear that our government's primary interest in maintaining our own carbon tax regime is the rebating and revenue sharing model it has developed. Bill 3 is careful to avoid repealing rebates and does not amend the Income Tax Act. If passed, Bill 3 would maintain the cost of living offset, or COLO, and other rebates. Exemptions for industry will be maintained through the relevant sections, Section 8 of Bill 3, that allows the Minister to create grants for industrial emitters. This power is irrespective of whether industrial emitters are taxed normally or through the output-based pricing system that is in the federal regime. This is the situation in Yukon and Nunavut, who allow Ottawa to collect the tax but maintain their own locally developed systems of rebates. Our carbon tax regime will net the GNWT $74 million in general revenue over the next 4 years. These monies are not destined for low carbon initiatives, and therefore our system is not revenue neutral. This contrasts with BC's very successful carbon pricing system that has seen 15% economic growth since implementation in 2008 and some of the lowest income taxes in Canada. And also the federal system, which returns all monies raised in the jurisdiction of origin. There are enough substantive policy concerns that a system reset enabled through Bill 3 would be an efficient and effective way to resolve them in a timely fashion. For example, is the tax appropriately targeting the greatest source of emissions in the NWT? The Canadian Climate Institute has reported that, quote, industrial carbon pricing has 3 times the impact on greenhouse gas emissions as than the consumer carbon emissions. Industrial carbon pricing is projected to reduce emissions by between 23 and 39%, where on contrast, consumer carbon tax will reduce emissions between 8 and 9%. Last year, industrial emitters in the NWT paid $12,686,000 in carbon taxes and received $45,409,000 in rebates. By contrast, consumers received rebates of $30,184,000 over the same time. Our current system hands over $15 million more in rebates to industry than we provide to our own residents, even though industrial emissions form nearly 90% of the NWT's total greenhouse gas emissions. I believe that Bill 3 addresses long-standing and current concerns many Northerners feel about national policies being foisted upon the NWT without clearly understanding our socioeconomic realities. I also believe it will provide policy clarity for the GNWT as the equally long-standing calls for a carbon tax exemption by public officials will be consistent with the GNWT's own policies and taxation measures. That concludes my opening comments. I look forward to answering the committee's questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chestart. I'll now put it over to committee. Are there any questions for the sponsor of the bill from committee? Mr. Hawkins, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the first question really is to ensure we get it on the record. Does the member expect that there will still be some form of carbon tax in the future, assuming Bill 3 proceeds in the manner it does? Because we want to make sure that's clear to citizens one way or the other, and as such, it could be perceived by some that this would be a complete elimination of all carbon tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member. Yes, my assumption, or it is clear that jurisdictions that aren't compliant with some sort of federal carbon pricing that's tied to the benchmarks established by the federal government will have the Greenhouse Gas Prevention Act and the measures in place imposed upon them. That's the case with Alberta, with Saskatchewan, and several other provinces as well. For those jurisdictions that choose to opt in, as in Yukon and Nunavut, they've been allowed to develop their own systems that hybridize with the federal collection and imposition of the tax. We've heard our colleague, the Minister of Finance, say that she does not believe that's a likely option for the Northwest Territories if this bill should pass. I think we don't know the answer to that, but the nuance is, we are a consensus government. We are not a partisan government. In those jurisdictions where they would repeal a carbon tax provision, like they did in Alberta, for example. It was a majority government that did that. In this case, it would be the legislature that does it and the government that would have to execute that. So I think there's enough nuance that affords the GNWT the flexibility to bring our rebate system forward as an alternative. And I think there's enough goodwill between the cabinet and Ottawa to make that happen. This shouldn't be seen as a rejection of carbon pricing, or Bill 3, I hope, is not seen as a rejection of carbon pricing, rather ensuring that the system is, again, appropriately handed off to Ottawa, where, well, they'll be in charge of implementing and imposing it, as is the position of the GNWT. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow-up, Mr. Hawkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the answer. One of the challenges I hear more so at the Assembly than anywhere else, certainly not on the street, is what will the feds do? And I'm more convinced than ever that that's not our problem. I think that there will be a process whereby if the feds chose to do nothing, then the situation becomes a case of there's no carbon tax. But I highly view that that would be absolutely unlikely. And I'm concerned that we're spending too much time worrying about that when I naturally believe the federal government, as they've said in the past, saying if you don't do your system, we'll kick in ours. In other words, I think it's been substantiated enough what the final result or the ultimate remedy would be. Mr. Chairman, my question to the member really comes down to is those concerned about the federal response, is it the wrong question, or are we putting too much focus in on the wrong question right at this particular time? And we should be worrying about what's best for Northerners, whether Bill 3 is appropriate or not appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member. As I said in my comments, there is no federal tax, carbon tax in the Northwest Territories. This is a territorial carbon tax. So I think, you know, to answer that question, we need to be concerned with our own system rather than a system that has yet to take place. You know, we also know a federal election is coming. We know the party that's ahead in the polls has promised to scrap the tax as well. So I think this question is far from settled. But the current environment is if you're not compliant, there will be some form of taxation required. But I think this bill strikes the balance between, again, putting the responsibility on, again, the government that imposed this on the Northwest Territories, as is the long-stated position of the GNWT in passing the legislation to begin with, while still allowing us the flexibility of our own system of rebates, which seems to be in my conversations and listening over the years, seems to be the real crux of our system. So, yeah, to answer the question, I do think there's too much emphasis being put on the federal response, whereas we should be concerned with what kind of policies we want our government in the Northwest Territories to develop and to impose, and whether those policies are working for Northerners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. McNeely next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question to the member is, I know we've talked this here over and over numerous times here in the past several months here, but did the member have recent discussions with the federal counterparts to gauge their support for a change? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tester.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member. So, as the member knows, I'm not a minister of this government, so any discussions I have aren't in an official capacity. But I have spoken with our MP, and I've spoken with some political staff at the federal level as well. They understand what the policy intentions are of this bill. You know, and they do understand this is a live issue in the Northwest Territories. And interesting enough, the feedback I got was that in Yukon and Nunavut, this doesn't seem to be such a live political issue. It seems that their system is much less, or is much more accepted than it is in the Northwest Territories. And I think that's something to consider as well. Have we managed this appropriately? And I think by putting so much emphasis on that point, that it's been forced upon us, and we don't want to do this, that we lend ourselves to be, we raise this to a more political level rather than a public policy level as an effort to combat climate change. So I think that's something to really consider, and you know, also considering out of the 3 Northern Territories, we have the highest amount of emissions, more so than Nunavut and Yukon, and I think per capita we're one of the highest in the country. So we do need some form of carbon pricing. We need some form of emissions reduction system, and I think we're not hitting those targets. We can't know if the system is working at all, other than how we're managing the cost of living increases. So I don't know. It's not my responsibility to negotiate with the federal government. It's someone behind me in this room, who I think you'll hear from next. But I remain confident that we have enough goodwill, again, as a consensus government, that we can work with Ottawa to build a better system, which much more resembles Yukon and Nunavut and takes the pressure off this question and lowers the temperature on carbon pricing. Because if we continue to maintain that this is not our choice, and we would get rid of it tomorrow if we could, we're always going to raise this issue of should we even have it in the first place. And I think we need to do better in just managing expectations around this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McNeely? Okay. I have Mr. Rogers next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, given, I guess, when the carbon tax was, GNWT decided that they implement their own system, it was to give flexibility to the GNWT in administering the carbon tax. Mr. Testart states that there's, I think, 71 million in revenues coming forward in the next, since till 2028, I believe. I guess my question is, given that the federal government at this point does not really seem to appear to fully understand the challenges of energy and infrastructure certainly in our territory, and certainly in my region, given the fact that we don't have an exemption on natural gas up there, and that's going to be a concern going forward, a concern I've heard from many residents. How would the member comment on how transferring that then, that, I guess, collection of that additional 71 million, how that would help mitigate that?
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that's an excellent question. I too have many constituents who are on natural gas and aren't receiving the exemption that heating oil and diesel customers receive. I think we should remember that the exemption on heating oil was not a GNWT decision. It was a federal decision that the GNWT mirrored and chose to mirror. It wasn't a requirement to mirror. That's why we had the kind of lag time between the initial decision last year and the decision April 1st. So I don't think that this came from like a lack of understanding of the North. I think it came from pressure from a much larger region of the country that still is dependent on heating oil, much like the North. So it's a happy coincidence, but that natural gas question is a live one. But our current system isn't going to afford the decision to exempt fuel is a federal decision. It's a decision that's determined by the backstop and by the federal benchmarks. It's not a decision we can determine locally. So my answer to the question would be, the feds are dictating whether or not we exempt fuel in the first place, so why not let them collect it at the same time? Because if they did so choose to exempt natural gas in rural Canada or in Arctic Canada, which would impact Inuvik, they would have to do it on their end, and then we would have to copy it. So again, we'd see that same lag time. Let's say tomorrow Justin Trudeau does it, well then we'd have to wait a couple months for our government to catch up, presumably. So any kind of substantive decision around exemptions is a federal responsibility. Any decision around rebates is a territorial responsibility. So if that's the way it works currently, why not just move the authority to Ottawa so they can, if those decisions are made, if those new exemptions come in, they're made instantaneously instead of requiring the lag time that we saw in the past year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow up to Mr. Rogers.
Sure. So yeah, so I guess it's safe to say, as the member said, we had I think a 6-month lag time when they did the exemption on diesel. If we were successful in lobbying Ottawa, or our government was successful in lobbying Ottawa, to also provide an exemption to natural gas, then I guess what the member is saying is, would you agree that we'd still be looking at likely a 6-month lag time before we can actually implement that?
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am not sure, and again, I think the finance minister would be a better person to ask that. But based on what we know about the last fuel exemption, yeah, it was a 6-month period. It won't be instantaneous, right? Anytime if a regulatory change is made to the federal benchmarks, then it would immediately kick in if we were on the federal system. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have Mr. Jericon next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I only want to add to my colleague over here, Mr. Rogers' question, adding that, we talk about natural gas, but we also have residents in my riding and probably in Yellowknife as well that are using propane as well. And that's a big issue as well. And that needs to be looked at as well. So I know you guys want to put that out there too as well. That's something that you have to take a look at. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Jericon. Would you like to respond, Mr. Testard?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that this is a good opportunity to raise those concerns. And I would encourage the committee, if there is a gap, like propane and natural gas, which is one fuel source for the purposes of the tax, I would suggest looking into that and making recommendations in addition to your review of the bill, because this is a good time to make those policy recommendations that fall outside perhaps the scope of what the actual contents of the bill are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Jericon?
Mr. Chairman, now that you're moving forward with this bill, just in your discussions along the way leading up to where we are today, have you get much feedback from the public and in general of what's been proposed? And I just want to know what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you. To Mr. Testard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for the question. This was a really live issue during the election. This is what I heard. It was one of the top 3 issues I heard from people, intimately tied to the cost of living. But the carbon tax, the fuel exemption had just happened federally, and that was top of mind during the campaign period. So it was a discussion that came up, and people are very, at least the people who reached out to me, and I'm sure this isn't universal, but I think the sizable majority of folks I spoke to are very dissatisfied with how the system is working. And it comes from 2 places. One, just kind of a flat-out rejection of carbon pricing as an unnecessary driver to the high cost of living in the Northwest Territories, and that is very similar to about 40% of Canadians who are unhappy with how it's working as well. But there's also a substantial portion of people who are very concerned about climate change, who are worried that the current carbon system is not working, that it puts too much emphasis, or it puts the same onus on consumers as it does on industrial emitters, and gives industry too big a break. So you've got kind of 2 sides of the spectrum, people who are like, repeal it or abolish it, and people who are like, no, we need it, but we need it to work better. And I think that shows that the system needs to be improved. And if Bill 3 can be thought of as anything, think of it as a system reset for this new government, this new assembly to tackle. I think it's a good way to think about it. It doesn't mean we're going to get rid of the carbon tax, but it does mean we can rethink the rebate structure and how we're using those revenues once we have those new negotiations with Ottawa. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I have Mr. Hawkins next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in thinking about this, I was reflecting back on a former member, former speaker, former highly respected and beloved teacher of mine and many at Sir John. That was Bob McQuarrie. And I remember one of his classes, he very specifically had talked about taxation is levied based on the principle of need and necessity of a government with a purpose. And I've never forgotten his classes, and it's interesting that I represent his seat that he did back 40-some years ago, had we known. And I think the current tax, to some imagination, without really reaching too far, doesn't meet that principle. It almost seems to contradict itself. It's almost just a tax for a tax purpose. Because if it's not being raised for a need, it's being raised in the context of a response. But the purpose of the tax can't be measured, so we don't know what it's doing. So therein lies the issue that I'm struggling with here is, so back to, if the purpose of the tax is to encourage or redirect behavior, but we don't know what it's actually doing in the context of reducing carbon emissions, Does the member bringing forward this bill feel that the current structure of the taxation system is achieving its principal objectives of why citizens are being taxed? We'll start with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. To Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. I think you've tapped into one of like the key principles of why this bill I think is required, and that's because we can't measure whether or not our system's meaningfully reducing emissions as an independent policy initiative apart from everything else. Currently, the largest drop in emissions since the Climate Change Action Plan was developed, or climate change strategy, is due to mines shutting down, not due to low carbon initiatives or certainly the carbon tax. And I think that is problematic if you can't measure the purpose of a tax. That's designed to encourage consumers and industry to invest or switch to low carbon alternatives. You can't well understand if that's actually taking place. When you think of something else we tax, like alcohol or cigarettes, to decrease consumption. I think currently the price of a pack of cigarettes is around $25. That definitely has an impact on consumer activity. The problem in the Northwest Territories is you don't have the alternative to switch to an electric car or heat pumps. The infrastructure isn't in place. The technology isn't proven in some cases. So you're continuously escalating the tax as you reach the final range of it, which is designed, it's phased in over time to allow Canadians and Northerners to switch to those things. So when the full extent of the tax comes in, most people have, in theory, have switched to other alternatives, or provincial, territorial, and the federal government will have invested in public transit options or other low carbon alternatives to take emissions out of the transportation sector, out of manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have that in the Northwest Territories. So as the tax escalates, Northerners are going to pay more and more, but they don't have the means to switch to low carbon alternatives. And that is fundamentally a challenge in designing a system. And I think this is why we're in discussions around exemption territories, because if you can't switch, what's the point? It just becomes a tax on people. And at this point, I think it's very much felt as a tax on people because those options aren't available. And it's not revenue neutral, as I think other members have said. And in the case of our tax, where you have $74 million that'll be raised as general revenue over the next 4 years, a government could say that $74 million is going to go to the Arctic Energy Alliance, and every dollar of that figure is going to go to low carbon programs and rebates, programs and granting programs for improvements for consumers, or some sort of other program. But we're not doing that. So again, like, what are we really doing with this? It seems when you see so much money going into general revenue, when you see a lack of clear reduction of targets, it starts to feel like just any other tax, and not like a tax that's targeted at changing behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow-up, Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you. I think Mr. Chester took my next area I was going to question on, is what are the alternatives that he sees under the current regime, which is, either heat or don't heat your house, type of thing. You can only walk to work or to the store or so much. There's certain behaviors. There is a lack of busing system. There is no power grid infrastructure to charge your cars out of Yellowknife, let alone anywhere. So, I mean, you'd be struggling. So I think maybe just the last area I'll question, Mr. Chairman, really is, given the fact that the large emitters, have declared for years, not days, not months, but years, that they'll be shutting down very soon. Do you think, in some ways, from your perspective, that Bill 3 is solving a problem where most citizens view the responsibility has become a punitive measure on citizens who are trying to heat their homes or go to work, versus targeting at a system such as the heavy industry, who will be resolving a lot of the emissions themselves, or resolving the issues of the emissions themselves when they close their operations, and as they have been closing their operations and working towards that. So in other words, give it a bit of time, not a lot of time, in the foreseeable future, won't we be achieving our targets by allowing them to do that, but the citizens carry this current burden, financial burden? Thank you.
Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the largest, I know actually, the largest bulk, that 90% of industrial emissions is caused by transportation. So, regardless of the mining, what active mines we have at the diamond mines, we're still going to have transportation, and that's still going to be driving the bulk of our emissions. But total emissions will be reduced because those large economic drivers will be out of play. But you've tapped into kind of a big debate around climate change policy: is should citizens, individuals, be paying the cost of stuff that's being driven by industry largely? I mean, the global emissions are driven by the oil and gas sector as a whole, the production and transportation of those fuels. So I don't think we can answer that with this bill or today, but I do think the Northwest Territories, to be viable into the future, we do need to invest in these technologies and find a way to make them work in the North. Whether that's small modular nuclear reactors, whether it's like hydro projects like Talston, or something, a run of the river on the Mackenzie. Like, there are options out there. And I think we'd be better served by using these revenues to develop and explore them. The future of the minerals industry depends on this as well, because if you can't get a clean mine, you're not going to build a mine. That's just how it works now. So you're not going to be able to raise the capital under the current prevailing market conditions. So we do need clean energy. We need some sort of mechanism to fund those projects. Carbon pricing is a good system. It's just the system we have in place right now isn't working. And I think that's what we need to ask ourselves, is how do we build a better system? And, should we explore cap and trade if it is an industrial problem and not a consumer-based problem? If there's no consumer-based measurements for change, but Diva can build a wind farm, maybe it is something that we should put on industry's shoulders, and that seems to be that's something I think we have the opportunity to explore as the 20th Assembly, and we should explore. But this bill is the starting point to have that discussion, and I think it's very important that we continue on. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Mr. McNeely next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really want to get, we kind of touched on it here with our recent colleague discussions here on what is the benefit of Bill number 3. And are we going to see more transitioning to a low green economy in terms of more federal resources going to the reductions of our general population, reducing their carbon? And you had mentioned the electric vehicles and the infrastructure needed to go on this transition of reduction. Without any federal help, it ain't going to happen. And really, we are, to a large extent, Northwest Territories, the victim of carbon emissions. We're forced to accept the imposed bills of legislation from the federal government, but yet at the same time, we may get some subsidies. But is it really worth the while for the individual to live here with continued imposed taxes? Now, if this bill is going to make it more efficient and more beneficial, then maybe we should take that into account during our discussions. But if we haven't received the benefits so far from this carbon tax that we've seen, and I think 99% of the Northwest Territories would agree, what have we seen to help us offset our cost of reductions? How many power stations do we have in this community of 20,000 people? 1, 2. I know I don't see any in my communities in the Sawtoo. I'm not familiar with the Delta, but I feel that we're really not getting benefits through resources needed for this transition. So how is this bill going to make it better for us? Is it going to build better relations with the federal counterparts? I just ask those questions to give you an idea. And I guess really my question is the value of this bill. What is the value of this bill for the residents that we serve? We know the cost. And we can go to any given store, and I've been to numerous stores in my riding as well as throughout the communities, and it's just unbelievable on the rotten fruit and expired products that are on the shelf for us to purchase. It's actually terrible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member. And certainly, I hear from Yellowknifers because that's my riding, but learning from my colleagues from up and down the valley, and especially the smaller communities, you hear the real stories of how taxes like these and any kind of what feels like a marginal cost to the increase of living in the capital is gets exponentially greater as you move farther and farther away. So we have a responsibility to ensure that our policies and programs are benefiting those communities that need them the most and that are the hardest hit by them. So, and I think we do need to have a better sense of how this is actually impacting people. We know how the COLO works. We know that 90% of revenues, I think, are around there, so it's the vast majority goes back to Northerners. But we still have this issue with the $74 million over the next 4 years that is unspoken for and isn't being used to target renewable programs and low carbon emission programs. And I think that's an issue, and it's an issue that allowing the federal taxation to prevail over this system would fix, because the feds wouldn't give money back to the GNWT as general revenue. It would have to be targeted at a reductions program as per their policy things. I mean, anything can potentially be negotiated, but looking at the Nunavut and Yukon systems, that's how they work. All the money goes back, and that's what we could encourage the finance minister to pursue as well. And I think that would help deal with that question of like, well, what are we really getting for this? Because it just feels like a tax. I think the other thing too is when we have these debates as political leaders, with one side says, well, people are upset about this. The other side says, we don't even want it. It's been forced on us. And as long as we're locked in that discussion, no one's really taking responsibility in the Northwest Territories for it. So again, I think the value of this is to put the responsibility squarely on the government that imposed it, because that has been a stated area of public policy. This has been imposed on the North. It's not something we want. And then we deal with how we're spending the revenues to reduce that tax burden on Northerners. That should be the debate we have here, not should we be raising this tax or not, but how are we actually using those monies to benefit our communities? And right now we're still trapped in that first stage discussion, which is, should we even have it in the first place, which is, long gone. And we should be focused on the question you've raised, which is how are we using these revenues to benefit our communities, especially those rural, remote communities that really depend on keeping the costs low, because any increase is a shock that can make price people out of their own communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow-up to Mr. McNeely? No follow-up. Mr. Rogers, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, first off the hop, I think the entire territory should be exempted from the carbon tax, Mr. Chair. Certainly, I just drove a vehicle from Inuvik to Yellowknife, and I can tell you the number of B trains and the number of semi-trucks that I passed were way too many to count. So I don't think we're in the territory, unfortunately, close to being off fossil fuels yet to get our products and get what we need in the communities. And I can speak for my region. In the Inuvik region, the Beaufort Delta region, I mean, homes there are heated by diesel. Right now, I've got one business, for example, who's approached me and has switched back from gas to diesel because diesel is actually cheaper in my region right now, which is unfortunate because he's kind of being penalized for burning that cleaner fuel up there. which a question I would have for the minister, not the member I know. But I guess what I need to know, which system, I guess, in Mr. Testart's opinion, is going to help us, going to help me mitigate the costs. I mean, we do have someone now looking at electrifying the Dempster, which is, I think, an amazing program, and I hope that works out. But the fact of the matter is, we're paying $17 for a bag of 6 oranges, and that's in Inuvik, and it's higher than that in the communities. So, by doing this, is this going to help us, be able to mitigate, those costs and come up with some form of either an exemption, additional rebate, something to help the residents in the rural communities in the north? Because, we're never going to attract people to come here if people can't afford to live here. And I think that's the overarching thing here is that people will leave. So, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Testart for response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I think that's a really unfortunate situation that the policy decision is incentivizing people to move to a less clean fuel because the cost benefit isn't there. And that's why when we say it's a national policy that's not working locally, that's a perfect example of that. I think if I don't think anyone can make the federal government do what we want, short of even electorally, only having one seat is just one voice. But I think, putting some pressure, just like the Atlantic Canada did as Northern Canada, to say we need something that works better, we need something that takes this reality into account, is something we should be working on. Rather than a blanket exemption or like a big policy change saying, oh, we just shouldn't apply, we need to demonstrate how we're doing our part as a leader in the Arctic globally and in Canada to mitigate climate change and to develop our own policies to do that. And I think we've struggled as a government to accomplish that. And again, this position of climate change is not something we want to do, something we're forced to do, and we get rid of it tomorrow if we can. It isn't helping things. It's not helping provide policy clarity. So, one, we solve that problem, we settle that debate, and then it becomes a debate of what we do with the resources. And I think, we've talked about the $74 million figure for good reason, because that's a lot of revenue that we know we're getting. That's not going to change, and we can use that to maybe fund a program to help those on natural gas. Maybe enhance the colo for certain regions. Like there's got to be ways to make it work. We're a creative bunch. We have a very competent finance minister, so I'm very confident we can get things done. But we need to show leadership on this, right? And this is a good place to start by saying, it's time for a system reset and to take a look at this in totality and make it work for the North, because currently, as the case the member just raised, it's not. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up? Mr. Jerkon, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to talk about this a little more. I know this issue in carbon tax came up in the 18th Assembly. I was there in the 19th Assembly when I voted against it as well. In my riding, we got the community of Tutsuke that probably has one of the highest cost of living. I mean, everything we do there, we have to either fly in or bring in by barge. We don't have winter road. We have a lot of homes throughout the Northwest Territories that are on oil-fired furnaces and boilers. There's really no alternatives right now. We talk about power, probably even heating our homes down the road, but that's years away. But at the same time, the cost of living is going up, and the government of Canada is imposing, this carbon tax onto us. And it's getting to the point now where we have our own people are leaving the north now to settle in the south because they just can't afford to live here. And, what I don't hear from this government here is that we're not standing up to Canada and talking about this fuel subsidy and carbon tax that they want to impose onto us. We're not ready. We're not ready by a long shot here to be in 2035 to be completely off the oil system. Canada talks about all this money they're want to put out there, but what I don't hear and see is that what does it mean to the people in my riding, to the small homeowners we're not ready yet to convert our homes from oil fire to gas or propane, but yet we're paying a premium just to fill up a tank in Toots Case, about $2,500, and that's unheard of. We got no economy in our community in that riding other than you work for chief of council or the corporation. So, this bill that you're proposing, we need to have it made in the north, but then, when we have that, we say it's going to be made in the north, but yet the GWT and cabinet and the minister, they design this the tax regime so that it only benefits certain people. I was a big fan in the 19th Assembly to support and adopt the Yukon model as to how they're going to impose and give the money back to the people. But here, we talk about consensus government, and then we're trying to work through committee. So, it's a concern that I have that, we're not doing enough. And maybe if the member could talk about what can we do more and to maybe try to get government on side to really take a look at our issues. And I understand, and I want to thank the member for putting this bill forward. And what we're sharing is no different from the 18th, 19th, and 20th Assembly. But yet, here we are, we're just status quo. And we're going to continue to take what's coming down the pipe from Ottawa, but we're not standing up. And I want to know what the members maybe could add to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to Mr. Testart for response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, member. So I was a member during the 18th Assembly when carbon tax came in, and I watched the debate from the 19th Assembly, and I was really struck by the report committee read, where they quoted from the 18th Assembly's the predecessor committee's report, and said the same thing essentially, and that was. Normally you expect things to change, and things to maybe improve, smooth out as in the fullness of time, but it was, basically the same discussion, and it was not a unanimous bill like most of the things we do in this House, in this system, are unanimously supported, and that was a very high-profile example of something that wasn't, and good legislation doesn't need to please, or not everyone needs to be 100% on board, but it should make everyone at least content that it's achieving the right policy objectives, even if there's some differences of opinion on how to get to the end result. But this seems to be, we're missing that fundamental thing of what are we trying to achieve with this system. And you're talking about your residents. These are consumers. These are people who are responsible for the vast or 10% of taxes, and the vast majority of emissions. The vast majority of emissions in the Northwest Territories are caused by industry. And I think we should have a system where industry is at the focus of our efforts to reduce emissions. And when we're raising $12 million from industry and giving them back $45 million, there seems to be a discrepancy there, especially when that's in excess of what we pay back to consumers. So I think these are the reasons why we're still having this debate and why we need to have that reset. And at the very least, we know that a reset allowing Ottawa to administer the tax, the collection of the tax, will ensure that every dollar that comes back to the Northwest Territories is used for rebates, and we can develop rebates that better meet the needs of your constituents, my constituents, and all of our constituents, but that's focused on alleviating consumers who do not have the ability to switch to other options, whereas industry actors, especially industry actors like the diamond mines, have the resources to develop alternatives. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow-up, Mr. Jericho?
I'll probably be asking this to the minister as well as she comes up, but I know that right now in Canada we have, I think 7 provinces and 3 territories are really opposing this carbon tax and the way in its form. Here we are, we're elected to represent our people in our ridings and through the Northwest Territories, but again, I don't see our government standing up, including the Premier, other than he made comments already publicly about this, but again, we should be pounding the table and say, hey, look, enough's enough. I mean, it's the cost of living is just getting out of hand. And so this bill that was proposed by the member here, if it goes ahead and goes through, what can we do different here to really trying to rattle the chain in Ottawa to say that, when we say we got 7 provinces and 3 territories, somebody's got to give. Here we are, we got a cabinet, we got a premier. To me, again, we're not standing up for the people of the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, if sending kind of if a political point is something you wish to make, Mr. Jericon, that I would suggest that supporting this bill would be a way to do that, and your support can be framed around those questions. The government of Saskatchewan has said they're not going to collect the tax on heating fuel because they're opposed to how the exemption's been taken. And there's several provinces that have said we're not playing ball, and they've taken the government of Canada to court. So I mean, if those are the kind of direct responses you're looking for, we have examples of those. It's something that the GNWT has opted not to do, and I don't necessarily agree with those approaches because we do need to do something about this problem. But I think when you look at the 3 jurisdictions, Quebec, BC, and the Northwest Territories that have their own system, BC has had a system since 2008 that predates the national model. Quebec has a cap and trade system that works completely differently from the federal backstop. Ontario did as well until the Conservative government under Doug Ford got rid of it, and then they went to the federal model. But both those other systems are discrete in how they operate. That's very different from how the federal system operates. Ours is a carbon copy with its own unique rebate system. Yukon and Nunavut, as you mentioned, the Yukon model, they allow the federal government to collect and administer the tax, and then they decides how it's spent. That's what this bill envisions happening. We have our neighbors look the same way. We can be consistent across the board, and we can, again, focus this discussion on how we're using these resources to help our people and to help fight climate change and adapt to climate change and create resiliency. And this is something the finance minister has mentioned, that this is where she wants the discussion to go. And I think we can have both discussions at the same time because we have to pay for those improvements no matter what. We know this is a government that is signaling that it's going to contract spending, but we have resources coming in from this carbon tax that we can use to develop these programs and these infrastructure projects, and maybe grants for home improvements as well that would help in community-based programs. So I think if your goal is to send that message and stand up for or use this as a platform to send that message, I think Bill 3 helps you do that. But I do think that technically what we can do is achieve something that's better than we currently have, that does a better job at using carbon pricing in a way that is more satisfactory to the needs of the North, and that focuses the discussion on where it needs to be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do I have any further questions from committee for Mr. Testart? Okay, seeing none from the committee, I do have a few of my own. So, Mr. Testart, the first question I have is, so my understanding is the Bill 3 does not repeal the rebate system, but I would note that the federal government is not under the jurisdiction of the Northwest Territories. So my interpretation of this is that it does repeal our authority to set those rebates. So I guess I would ask for the members' comment on how we are going to ensure that the rebates will remain and that we can have this debate. I mean, I have a follow-up question about the rebates themselves, but how can the member ensure that the rebate system that the territory has in place is actually going to be preserved if Bill 3 passes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the rebates would be unfunded because there's a linkage between the tax and what's funding the rebate program. So without the tax portion, they become unfunded, and then they'll have to be another source of revenue that's identified to fund them. I think conceptually, we know that the direction of the federal government is going to be to impose the backstop, and then they'll need to use those revenues to plug it into an existing system. They can use what they've developed, the Canada or carbon action payments. They keep changing the name, so I think that's where they're at now. And the 10% they give to businesses and hospitals and things like that. Or they can use our system like they do in Nunavut or Yukon. We don't know what they'll do. There is uncertainty there, but it's the most certain kind of uncertainty. We have 2 northern jurisdictions that are also territories that operate the way this bill envisions. I think it's very likely we can have that same, we can emerge with the same system intact. So I'm not overly concerned about this. And if there was a situation where the federal government said no, then the regulations could be changed, so the rebates stay on the books, but they're no longer funded and no longer kick in. And then the Northerners would enjoy the rebates that are coming out of Ottawa, which may be greater than our current payments. We don't have those numbers clearly before committee or before the public, and so yeah, there are known unknowns, but I don't think it's unsurmountable, which is why the bill maintains those systems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to some comments that you had made about industry. It sounded like, well, what you said was you feel industry is getting too much of a break and that burden is currently being put on the public. But the bill that you've brought forward does not propose to change the rebate structure. So why does the bill that you've brought forward not simply speak to the concerns that you're speaking to about industry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, when we're taxation policy and spending policy is a prerogative of the government, and they of course, something we develop collaboratively as per our conventions as a consensus government. And I was mindful of that when bringing this forward, that I wanted it to be, to be as collaborative as it could be, given that there's going to be some opposition to it. And in this case, I knew that the largest concern was around the rebating structure, and I thought it best to leave that question separate from this and allow us to have this discussion around it through a policy discussion around how it works, because I think we're going to need a rebate system at the end of the day. The minister says that this is the system that is the best system for the Northwest Territories. So the question of the taxation seems to be something that we can actually have this debate on and move, which is what we're doing. Yeah, so I think scrapping the entire thing was a possibility, but I thought when you hear the concerns that have been raised by the minister, when you see the work that successive committees have done, there's some good stuff in that rebate program, like the grants to municipalities and the revenue sharing options, that I didn't want to throw in a whack. If you take one part out of the rebate system, there's consequences there, and I'm just one member. I don't have a large staff of financial analysts who can help me design a robust carbon rebating system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions from committee? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much, Mr. Testart. Okay, next on the agenda we have Minister Wozenek has signed up to make comments, so I would invite her and any witnesses she wants to bring forward to the witness stand. Thank you. If other people want to. Okay. Okay, Minister Wozniak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I don't have necessarily very formal remarks, and in part because we wanted the opportunity to have an understanding of what committee wanted to hear. This is obviously a different role than what I'm typically in before committee. I would like to, though, I do a few things I want to go through before I entertain any questions, if there are any for me. In my view, what this bill really does provide is two things: uncertainty. There is absolutely no guarantee that the federal government will let us keep anything. Not the benefits, not the good things, not the things we like, whether that's our carbon tax offset payments, whether that's the community revenue sharing. There is no certainty that they will let us keep anything. What they have done, I think the example was given of Saskatchewan earlier, where Saskatchewan stood up and said, we don't like it, we're not taking your tax anymore. And what the federal government turned around and said to Saskatchewan was, okay, and you're not getting any carbon offset payments anymore. That's what happened in Saskatchewan. So if that's the route you want to take, that is the certainty you get. Saskatchewan stood up and said, we're not collecting, and the federal government said, you're not getting your rebates. So that's the kind of public fight that you can get into with the federal government, should you want to. And that's a jurisdiction that has quite a lot more MPs than what we do in terms of the political clout that one might have. I like to think we have a better relationship than that. Consensus government isn't modeled on being partisan, it is modeled on relationships. But if we want to take that hardline approach, that's the example. But the other certainty that we get, I would say, and the other certainty that we get is less revenue. If you take away our system, where we have the large emitters in the Northwest Territories pay carbon tax. Large emitters elsewhere are under a type of cap and trade system. This is the output-based system that the federal government has. So if it's not our system, and that the large emitters are there, they are not paying carbon tax revenue, which means the total revenue generated in the Northwest Territories is less, which means the amount of revenue that can flow back to us is less. So even if the federal government, in fact, gives us back 100% of every dollar collected in the Northwest or generated in the Northwest Territories, it's less because it's not any longer going to have revenues being generated by the large emitters. That program would be gone under the backstop system. So you're starting with less revenue. So again, uncertainty, less revenue, and the uncertainty matters. Our single biggest private sector contributor to GNWT, or to GDP, to jobs, is the mineral resource sector. And our program was designed around the kind of large emitters and large resource sector that we have, which is right now the 3 diamond mines. They've paid more under our system than what they would have been paying per se under the federal system. But beyond that, small mines won't get in under the wire of what would be required for the OBPS. The small mines that we're contemplating now, whether it's Prairie Creek, whether it's some of the lithium mines, they're just going to pay carbon tax. No rebate, no nothing. They're just going to pay carbon tax. And they're going to have to factor that in as they're factoring in whether or not their project is too marginal to start in the Northwest Territories. Do they even pursue it or not? Under the federal system, they are going to be paying taxes without any access to any kind of alternative programming. And I heard the concerns about, that it's on the backs of the residents, and that. We put out every year, and I just printed from the internet. It's online. The carbon tax report. So for 22-23, carbon tax report, it shows what in 22-23 large emitters. Well, the revenue generated from them is almost $25 million versus $10 million for every single other payer. Residents, small businesses, small governments, other governments, everyone else paid around $10 million, and the large emitters were almost $25 million. They're what's funding all of the stuff that we have in the Northwest Territories. So yes, they're getting some rebates, but they're also what's really funding the revenues that we're getting. So, yes, they are getting a rebate system, but they're also paying significantly more than what anybody else is paying. So, just keeping that in mind. And at the same time, they are certainly investing and looking for ways to reduce their carbon footprint. I mean, hopefully everybody's doing that. And I certainly wouldn't want at any point to suggest that that shouldn't be the goal. And that's certainly been a goal that I know I've started to talk, I hope a lot about, and I hope that message is getting through, that we really do need to be looking at ways to get off of carbon reliance and fossil fuel reliance. The question I would have, though, and this is coming back to the uncertainty that I say we get if we were to sort of throw our hands up, is we're having the same conversation about not liking the federal system and how we feel. And, you know, does repealing the carbon tax address how Northerners feel? I think it does. Northerners don't feel like they're being represented well. Northerners don't feel like the carbon tax necessarily addresses their needs and concerns. But we're trapped in this discussion about carbon tax. Right now, every jurisdiction in Canada is under an obligation by the federal government to be inside their parameters for having some sort of carbon tax. If we keep it and leave it as our system, and we are one of the last hangers on to doing it ourselves, right now, every single dollar generated in revenue under this tax, which we all have to have, which is everyone's acknowledging we have to have, every single dollar stays in the Northwest Territories. What's more, every single dollar generated goes through the Legislative Assembly. So if you don't like what we're spending money on with the government of the Northwest Territories, right now, we are the ones that decide what we spend money on as a government of the Northwest Territories. You hand that back to the federal government, they decide. So on its face, they've said as a policy that it's supposed to be revenue neutral. Well, already I said revenue will go down. If you wind up under the large emitters or under the output-based system, less revenue. But the other part is, it doesn't all go back into the pockets of residents. The federal system has a portion that goes back to residents. We've run calculations based on what now we are seeing coming across Canada under other backstop jurisdictions. And for a family of 4, we are getting more in the Northwest Territories than almost anywhere else in Canada. And we did our calculations based on what we know the carbon tax costs to be, so that the average household in the Northwest Territories is getting back what they were paying for carbon taxes. So that shouldn't be the issue. Whereas, I only have to run a Google search, or whatever search engine you might use, to see that the federal government only a couple of weeks ago was being told, hey, where's the $3.5 billion that you promised to small businesses and Indigenous governments? I don't know. I don't want to have to worry about it. I want all of the revenue that is required to be generated under that federal system to be generated and administered in the Northwest Territories and to run through the Legislative Assembly. So yes, could we spend it differently? I suppose. Could we find better and new ways to address climate change? For sure. But I would much rather have that debate and that discussion in the territories, because I'm not convinced that Ottawa or politicians in Ottawa will necessarily understand the importance of, let's say, highways to climate change. How will we resupply our northern communities? Are highways something that they're going to fund under climate change? Recently, that wasn't, again, some of the headlines coming out of Ottawa, that's not what I heard. And yet we all know the importance of interconnectedness. What about barging? What about maintaining those supply chains through railways? What about maintaining our airports? These are all climate change issues up here because we are so dependent upon those interconnectedness, and we're so dependent on getting a barge through because of low water. We're so dependent on those things. Permafrost heaves on highways. And so, would I like to see us reduce that? Have perhaps an opportunity for more EV vehicles? Absolutely. But I would like that debate to be had here where we understand the nuance and the particularity of what a supply chain is going to be like in the Northwest Territories and not had in Ottawa. And it's not to say that there's not a genuine desire anywhere else in Canada, including in Ottawa, to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels. It's that we understand the context here. And we understand that in Sax Harbor, when you get a new generator up there that's more efficient, and while yes, it still relies on fossil fuels, but the reliance has reduced significantly, it's far more energy efficient, this is a good news story. Because that's not a community where there's immediately going to be an alternative, whether solar or anything else, certainly not going to be hydro. So let's at least do what we can in that context and recognize that as an investment in climate change efficiency. And I'm not convinced that if we hand this authority back to Ottawa, that they will see those same connections that we do. What about housing? What about education? What about healthcare? What about the fact that we have to send folks south for medical travel? These are all costs and expenses that exist in the Northwest Territories. Everything in the Northwest Territories has connections to climate change because of the high costs of moving people and supplies. So again, keeping all these revenues here, Why are we so afraid of it? Why are we apologizing for the fact that we have revenues coming into the territories? We're going to have debates about how we resupply a community like Let's Okay, we should. But that's a debate for here, for how we use those funds to do it better. So, again, I appreciate my friend's comments of saying that there's some goodwill and political currency in Ottawa, that maybe they will just let us have back the system that we have now. But if there is some political goodwill and some political currency, I'd like to use it for, let's say, again, Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Tulson, run-of-river systems, NIHB. There are so many other issues. This shouldn't be the one that we're necessarily going to fall on our sword. I don't know that that is where we want to go. So I don't want to take up a lot of time. I'm happy to answer questions if committee does have it. Speaking just briefly about the concern around, the heating oil exemption took some time. Mr. Chair, there was a very particular frame of time where we happened to have had an election that happened to be delayed, and we wanted to put that question through some sort of a process before automatically bringing in the exemption. But if there's some future changes of the goalposts over in Ottawa, I would not expect that it's going to take as long for us to adjust our system here. It's very unlikely that we're going to wind up in the particular type of situation that we wound up there of having a delayed election and the timing that resulted. But what we will be doing is making sure that decision makers are in the Northwest Territories, elected by the people of the Northwest Territories to sit in this assembly, here, on this territory, in the territories, are the ones that are deciding what to do with the revenue that's generated in the North. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any other last words there, but I think, Mr. Chair, that's probably where I will stop. I am, again, hopeful that committee will, and I acknowledge that this is a difficult thing. I guess I do have one last comment to make. And it's around, why we're doing this and the policy debate, and the people are unhappy with carbon tax. And I do want us to tease out, and I acknowledge why the MLA wanted to bring something forward. He heard from people they don't like carbon tax. But not liking carbon tax on a national scale is different from saying that there's going to be a carbon tax and that we'd rather take that revenue and utilize it in the territories for territorial priorities. As for its success, and this is where I'll close, as for its success, I would implore committee, please, there is the infrastructure, has its strategy out right now for 2030 energy. And in that strategy, they're saying maybe we need to actually increase our targets. Maybe we should be more bold because, when those mines close, we are going to achieve the targets. That doesn't seem very bold. So what can we do with the funds that are coming in? What can we do with the revenues that we have to actually start to move the needle a little bit more? You can look at the business plan process that's coming forward for ECC, for EC&E even, for infrastructure. This is where we should be having the debate. And so I would implore committee to please bring those questions forward to the processes that we have and don't download this problem to Ottawa. You have to take questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. I have Mr. Hawkins first for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the Minister and her comments. Some of the things I heard, I was, I'm not really sure. I mean, their perspective, but I hear less revenues, but and a few other things about no rebates, but this bill has brought to us where we are today. It almost feels like the old slow moving car crash, which is, we see it coming, but are we really dodging out of the way? Are we able to stop it? So, what is being done? And so the minister's I could feel the passion that she doesn't appreciate the mechanisms of Bill 3, but perhaps maybe she misses sight of it. It's a response of how people feel. And that's, therein lies part of the issue. So the minister keeps saying there's no guarantees, no certainty, and I've heard this, it feels like that skipping record that just keeps coming around. So back to the slow-moving crash, has the minister done any work with respect to reaching out to Ottawa to talk to them about this? Because this is not new. This didn't just drop on the minister's desk yesterday. So if the minister has reached out, what information is she able to table to demonstrate she's put an effort into having this conversation that's around this room? Thank you.
To the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, so in the last assembly, I was able to table, and I imagine I could do it again. I don't know if there's rules around when one writes a letter that one can't table, but so it's already on the record and can be on the record again, a litany of letters that we wrote when the federal government was changing the goalposts the last time, asking for further exemptions, asking for alternatives for the North, seeking various changes, all of which were met with resounding no's. We were not the only ones to write. There was outcry from across the entire country around some of the changes that were coming, and the answers were no. It was clear to us that if we are now going to try to pull ourselves out of the system, like Alberta and like Saskatchewan or other jurisdictions that have said as much, that we'd be considered non-compliant. And when you're non-compliant, you fall under the federal backstop. So quite a number of jurisdictions went into that situation when they opted to not maintain their own systems. We held on to our system. But yeah, as for the amount of ink spilt on that, we've spilt a lot of ink on it. And this is where I'm imploring committee to consider a different approach. And rather than spilling ink on begging for some changes that have not been so far received with any positive response, I'm suggesting that we should be spending our time considering maybe we should be going to Ottawa and asking them to help us find alternatives to get off fossil fuel, investing in the North. Let's spend our political capital on and not make the situation and the relationship worse by going after them on this issue, as many right now are. But let's go and actually ask for some investments that can bring us to a situation where we're not so fossil fuel dependent. So I can retable where we were at. But again, as I said, I'd like to move this forward in a more positive direction that's actually going to make a meaningful difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, you have a follow-up?
And perhaps the mistake was mine for not emphasizing that there's been, I'm talking about now. And I think that was maybe lost on me to point out, maybe that was lost on the minister in the context. I mean, let me set the framework, Mr. Chairman. The carve-out happened last fall. This is a response to the carve-out. The Bill 3 has been introduced in recent months, and it was been talked about since we've been elected almost 6 months ago. So if the minister's saying everything she did was back in the 19th Assembly, frankly, I really don't care about that stuff at this particular second. What I'm saying is this conversation that we're having today is about what's happened in the last 6 months. So the carve-out had been initiated, and Bill 3 has been initiated, and the conversation of Bill 3 goes even further back than before it was tabled in the House. I'll let the minister clarify that nothing's been done since then, since basically the time frame I'm now framing up. So she can clarify that because she spent a lot of time on the 2019, and I say I'll take it in the context of maybe it was my error not framing the months or the date specifically. But my next question, really, Mr. Chairman, is about there's talk about from the minister whether it's factual or perception, which could be a bit of both, either way. About if we change our system, this will have sort of a negative effect on the mining industry. Yet the Northwest Territories is, I think, 13th in GDP in the sense of, it's not moving forward very fast, and some of the most robust industries in Canada are the Yukon and the Nunavut region, which coincidentally follow the federal system. So if it isn't punitive to Nunavut and the Yukon, I'm at a loss why it's absolutely seen as punitive in the Northwest Territories, other than the fact that we're feeding them these extra rebates, and of course they'll be cranky. So maybe the minister can clarify why it would be so punitive to the Northwest Territories with respect to that context. The Nunavut and the Yukon are certainly enjoying the fruits of a wonderful industry working very hard, creating a GDP that's satisfying the needs of their citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I heard a couple questions in there for the minister. To the minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, certainly have raised again since the re-election the issue of carbon taxes as well as at officials level. The response is always the same, and it is in line with what was previously put forward. But again, Mr. Chair, I do think that there are positive relationships between our cabinet for this government and Ottawa, do you think we also want to think carefully about where we put whatever political clout we have? And do we expend it on asking for something that we've been asking for years, along with every other jurisdiction, and to which we've all met with a resounding no? Or do we ask them to properly fund our healthcare system, and to fund Mackenzie Valley Highway, and to fund large-scale energy projects? And I have to say, I personally think that strategically it's more wise to put it in the latter. As for the concern around the mineral resource industry, Mr. Chair, Yukon and Nunavut, I'm not sure if their residents and their oppositions parties and politicians would all agree that their system and their economy is all just working hunky-dory. Their systems with respect to carbon tax were instituted back in 2018. We are not in 2018. I wasn't a politician in 2018, and so there was decisions made at the time not to join on. We are where we are now. The mineral resource sector that we have, particularly the 3 diamond mines, have modeled their own business planning based upon the system that we have had for now some 6 years. Changing that comes with cost to them. Comes with significant cost to change when you're already deeply in and you've already modeled your plans as far as you have. But beyond that, it's the small minings, the evolution of our sector is in smaller mines. So whether it's gold, whether it's lithium, whether it's the RREs, it's smaller mines. They will not make the cutoff for the OBPS system, which is the federal answer to large emitters, which means they're just going to pay carbon tax. And whether they get any kind of rebate ever from the federal government, again, headlines suggest to me that they won't, but not the federal government.
Thank you, Minister. I have Mr. Rogers next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for those comments. So, I mean, some of this, I think, comes down to trust as well, and we spoke about this when we first started this government, about trust, in our government's ability to continue to develop relationships with Indigenous governments, with municipalities, with NGOs, so on and so forth, and how some of that trust may have been lost. And maybe some of this is coming from that trust as well, to ensure that our government is able to administer this carbon tax program better than it would be done through the federal government, as other jurisdictions has done. But in looking back through 2018 when this came up, I mean, the big push to allow our government to do this was flexibility. There's flexibility on what we can do with it. So I guess my question is, where is that flexibility? Is that flexibility strictly for industry, or how do we make that flexibility? And you've heard me speak here when Mr. Testar was here about what's happening in my region and how the cost of living with natural gas. And I understand that that's not part of this bill. But if you're looking at flexibility, shouldn't that flexibility include the, relief for the most burdened areas, either through rebates and or concessions or exemptions? If we're going to be, if we're administering this to be flexible, how can we be flexible to ensure that the areas that are most burdened are getting the relief they need? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. To the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, So the flexibility that we have, for example, is that when the federal government changed the goalpost and required us all to come back, we were not allowed to have point-to-purchase rebates anymore. We all came back. And we then adjusted our offset payments to having 3 different tiers. The only jurisdiction, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in Canada that does this, where we look at the highest, the jurisdictions that pay the most for carbon taxes for heating fuel versus the lowest. And we've adjusted our rebate system to reflect the fact that if you took just an average, you'd have a lot more people not getting their full amount of carbon tax repaid to them. You'd have some getting a lot more because the average doesn't really properly account for the fact that some wind up paying a lot more and some wind up paying a lot less. So we've tiered it based on those communities that pay more in terms of their carbon tax burden because of more heat fuel use and those that pay less. So that is a very unique aspect. And another thing that we did, frankly, it came out of the debates, and it was at the suggestion of MLAs, and it was a good one, was to introduce the 10% revenue sharing, net revenue sharing with communities. So, and notionally, the thought is that community governments can use that to help offset their carbon tax burdens and their reliance on fossil fuels. But, again, these are our community governments that now get a 10% revenue stake. And that's despite the fact that, just to remind everyone that, community electricity generation is exempt. So they're not paying carbon tax on their electricity generation, but they do get this 10% revenue sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I understand that. I guess the commitment I'm looking for, and again, if I look at my region, if we were to continue with the current administrative regime for the carbon tax, I need to know that this government is willing to go to Ottawa and say, listen, our energy needs are different. You look at the territories, you look at now, where you look at, it was Valley View, we're complaining that they're paying $4.79 a gigajoule for gas, whereas, Nuvik, once the 23% kicks in, is going to be at $40 a gigajoule for gas. So it's significant in that region. I also understand the minister had spoke earlier about, getting to more green energy solutions, and I think that's great. But again, the reality is, in my region, I can point out a few trillion feet of natural gas up there that could be accessed. But other than that, in our region, the fact is that we are dependent, unfortunately, on diesel or natural gas up there. So I guess, yeah, I guess the commitment I would look for is the commitment to continue to find ways to offset this cost to the areas that are being overburdened right now, and particularly areas on natural gas and propane.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. To the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I can say that a federal engagement strategy for the whole of government is in development right now. Obviously, we needed to have priorities and a mandate to then develop a federal engagement strategy from that. But I feel fairly confident that projects that help move us forward in terms of our energy resiliency, I would expect will be part of that conversation. It's certainly a large part of my area of responsibility, not so much perhaps in finance, although that's associated, but certainly as being responsible for infrastructure and the Northwest Territories Power Corporation. It's certainly a large part of my area of responsibility, but even transportation, whether it's energy, whether it's transportation, these are all areas where we're being impacted by the costs and the reliance on fuel, of its various sorts. So, I can sort of personally commit, but I think really it's the federal engagement strategy more broadly that'll, I think, have some significant clout. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Ajirco next, and then Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Earlier, you heard me talk about the issues that are confronting us here in the north, and I just wanted to again point out that I know that in Government Canada you talked about moving the goalposts, etc., and it's still ongoing. It's going to continue probably for the next years to come. But I guess for me, what I sitting back on this side of the house, where as the MLA. What concerns me is that we need to look at ways to really set up to Canada by working with our partners in the provinces and territories as well. I know Cabinet and the Premier has a relationship with the Government of Canada in these fronts, but overall, I'm not sure, sitting on this side of the house, what are we doing to really stand up to really push our own agenda? I'm sure that the Cabinet has its own strategies and to deal with the high cost of living, and part of this is the carbon tax that's been imposed onto us, and to help reduce the cost of living here in the north. So I want to know if you have any comments on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. To the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, again, Mr. Chair, it feels like we've been already a government for a long time, but there was the priority setting process came first, flowing from which there was a mandate, flowing from which we would have a whole of government federal engagement strategy. That doesn't remove the obligation on each minister to have counterparts. So for instance, I had the opportunity to co-chair transportation ministers. If I have an opportunity like that, I'm going to attend and I'm going to speak to the realities and the issues of the North. speak to the challenges of barging to small communities, the challenges and the importance of having railway connections to get things to the barge, the importance of our airline industries, and to try to paint those pictures so that when funding pots are being created in Ottawa, they're being done in a way that reflects some of the needs that we're going to have here, whether that's pointing out how unconnected we are, so that, to just understand the magnitude of the challenge, to whether it's to point out, again, when you're talking about wildfire emergencies and climate change emergencies and situations created by all this change, that it's not only the communities that get evacuated, it's often communities like Little K or Fort Res who then can't have supply chains because of the impact on the hubs. So, cost of living is such a huge thing. But it's about, in my view, looking at the priorities that we've all set, which I think speak to those costs and speak to those needs, and then being able to affect a strategy that allows us to go to Ottawa to speak to them and not losing sight of those pictures when we go to Ottawa, not losing sight of those commitments that we've made as a group, and to not let ourselves get into, a singular, I guess that's my concern with standing up and saying we're going to repeal the carbon tax. It doesn't get to the bigger issue of how are we going to actually build the Northwest Territories? How are we going to actually fix the problems of our energy reliance, of our transportation corridors, of our supply chain routes? So I don't disagree. These are big conversations that we have to have. I think our priorities they're strong because they're few, and they are going to empower us to go to Ottawa more effectively and to raise those issues.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Jericon, do you have a follow-up?
Follow-up, and I guess my question is again to the minister is when you do sit down and if you do chair those committees, etc. in the south, and again, I want to continue to emphasize the high cost of living in our small communities, and if you can maybe continue to stress the importance of a winter road in my community, even fulfilling John Diefenbaker's dream of building a road from Yellowknife all the way to Fort Resolution, if it's okay. Area. Again, it's a dream, but anyways, it wouldn't hurt to put it out there because, but anyway, this will continue to drive down the cost of living and from those communities. And anyways, I just want to let you know that continue to lobby on our behalf. Thank you.
Mr. Jericon, to the minister.
Point well taken. I mean, I guess I don't have the solution for all of these things, but I would acknowledge and I would suggest that this is why keeping more revenues in the north is better, because the MLAs from regions who know their regions best will lobby ministers who are sitting here and accountable and walking around the streets of the Northwest Territories and accountable to the people in the Northwest Territories most directly. We're here on the ground. So if we're not achieving some of these goals, we're facing that pressure in a very immediate and public sense.
Thank you. I have Mr. Hawkins again. I mean, I did see Mr. McNeely's hand. Sorry, Mr. It's just that Mr. McNeely hasn't had a chance yet. Okay, all right. Mr. Hawkins.
Okay. Either way would have been fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McNeely. So if I understand it correctly, Quebec has had their cap and trade system in some form of it, that is, since 2013, and BC has had their carbon tax since 2008, and they're able to measure carbon emissions with respect to how they manage their system. The territorial government seems to be respectfully I'm really curious on why we can't, I guess that's the nicest way I can put it, is why we can't measure the results of this carbon policy and the reduction of emissions. I mean, isn't that the whole purpose of the tax? To drive different results, to get better results? In other words, get people off high carbon lifestyle to help reduce carbon emissions. So if I understand it correctly, the territorial government cannot measure its results, whether it has been an effective or ineffective tax, but rather it's just, well, it is what it is. Maybe the minister can enlighten us. Why is that the case? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, Mr. Chair, just referencing the 2022-23 Northwest Territories Carbon Tax Report. Again, I printed it, but I'm It is online, so it's something that anyone can go and just Google and it'll pop up for you. There are a number of figures in here that do make an effort to monitor and measure and demonstrate where we are at in terms of our fuel consumption. So the first one, for example, has Northwest Territories fuel consumption from 2013 through to 2022. It's broken down by different types of fuel. And I mean, some of the lines go down a little bit, some of them pop back up again. The challenge with that, and this is where it's the analysis of the data that I think gets interesting. So, look, you can look at carbon intensity. It's table 7 of the same document, and it shows that from 2009 versus 2020, carbon intensity of tons per person has dropped from 4.5 down to 2.9. It's the reasons underlying it that I think there's a hesitancy to say, oh, it's because we've got carbon tax that things have changed. So we can measure changes, and the document and this report does measure changes over time. The concern is, are those changes the result of behavioral changes because of carbon taxation, or are they resulting from behavioral changes due to other factors such as the volatility of the price of fuel and the high cost of the price of fuel? There's blips in here that you'll see because of COVID and the changes in the intensity of use of carbon fuels during the couple of years when there was a reduction in productivity due to COVID. So, again, the hesitancy is to say, we're doing well and it's because of carbon tax, as opposed to taxes or gas costs a lot here. People want to get off of it. One of the other interesting ones, I don't have it flipping around here, is there's been an increase in the amount of propane use. And that may well be because it's a less carbon, right, it is there. It's on the little chart I had before. So there's been a rise in the reliance on propane heating as a source of fuel. There's been a rise in the reliance on biomass. Again, is it because of carbon tax by itself? I would suggest not. Has carbon tax influenced it? Possibly. Have costs of those other fuels been a reason? Also possibly. Is it because people want to make a difference in climate change? Also possibly. So do I point to the carbon tax, or can I just say there's change? I can say there's change. I can't necessarily say it's causative because of carbon tax, but if it's contributed to it, well then great.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Hawkins, you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think, and I've heard this many times about there's no way to direct cause and the correlation of that to any of the data other than just best guess. And unfortunately, that is a very frustrating part for folks. And it's not about sort of magic wanding the issue of saying, well, it's all going to go away, but the reality of it is that if it's intended to drive carbon emissions down, people that bear all that burden of the responsibility of meeting that is the citizens paying it. In other words, we have to trust government but government can't prove it. Mr. Chairman, in the minister's words just a minute ago, she said there's a rise on the reliance of propane. I don't have to look too far around this room. We've already heard Mr. Jericon for Tuna Day, Mr. Rogers in Inuvik on how their citizens have this. Since we've heard of the federal exemption carve-outs, what work has been done on the propane question, which is the exemption of the carbon tax? I'm just going to park it and come back for a second. I get the fact that it took a few months to introduce because of legislation and election, yada, 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 to get us the exemption on the diesel fuel. But the same token is, government has many levers and many people on working many challenges all at the same time, Mr. Chairman. And frankly, you would almost be ashamed that the government hasn't advocated for an exemption on propane in this particular case, given the nature of it, and including natural gas, that is. So has the minister done any work whatsoever since, and I'll be careful this time, since the carve-out was announced? Apparently that was an issue the last time, for clarity on the answer. What work has been done on that to have the carbon tax removed from propane? And furthermore, what will the minister table? And trust me, I sent an email isn't enough, I'm sorry to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, our officials did raise it directly when this was first being, or when, I don't know if it was first, when it was being discussed at the federal level, and they were quite clearly told, no, there will not be an exemption for propane or LNG. I know that other jurisdictions made the same ask, some of them very publicly, and that the answer was also very publicly no. I also had the opportunity, though, to raise this at the finance minister's meeting, which is a table which normally wouldn't get this question. It's a table that, at least at the federal level, certainly I think has some clout. And I think I was joined by others. I don't want to speak to what may or may not have been said at that table. But certainly I think try to paint the picture, I hope very clearly at that table, the impacts of not expanding the carbon tax exemptions and the impacts of high costs in the north. And yeah, here we are with no exemption on propane, with no exemption for LNG, a limited exemption for heating oil that really, I don't think it takes a lot to see that it was done for political reasons, because there is an election coming and there's a cohort of potential votes at risk. And well, again, I wasn't in the room when the federal government made their decision, but on its face, that's what it looks like.
Thank you, Minister. I have Mr. McNeely next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Minister for coming in to help us understand this bill and make some suggestions. As we all know, the cost of living is high because of this. I was just looking at my pictures here before and after the Easter weekend, and before the retail cost of gasoline downtown Northern Wells was $2.62. After, it was $2.67. So when you look at that and you hear that and you hear other people, I hear a lot of major concerns on the cost of living and the hardships going through. It's very different because of the geography of our area. It's very different from one community to the next. So designing the bag of benefits and arguments to Ottawa like that, this is really hurting to the point where people are just better off to quit their job and go on social income. And that's a given fact. It may happen. And it also, might entertain the idea of joining the bootleg market. These are options that are out there that people have at their disposal, and it's driven by this high cost of living. I raised this at the 18th Assembly. What is this cost going to do for the trapper downtown Cova Lake when he goes to fill up his jerry can? Imagine John Doe doing that. And he says to the agent, why is this price going up? Well, the carbon tax kicked in. What is a carbon tax? So it raises a lot of unanswered questions, but the fact is the cost of living remains there and felt by John Doe. If we can say, okay, it's benefiting you in this way, it's creating revenues, and you're getting a rebate, and also with Mackenzie Valley Fur Genuine program, we're seeing rebates through that with your CAP program to assist you in grub staking your next season. So if we had examples of raised revenue to give to John Doe, he could say, oh, I don't mind paying it now because I'm seeing some return on my cost. The same as the entrepreneur would say, what is the rate of return on my capital? The capital in this case is the carbon tax, felt from every community, Sachs Harbor right down to Fort Smith. But there's a difference. The cost of living is different in these communities. So I think we really have to focus, and I want to know from the Minister, have you had some discussions with the federal counterparts on designing a benefits package applicable to different regions? As my colleague from Nuvik had mentioned, I can only imagine the huge concern and saying, I'm sorry, we're not exempt. The point is that you're heating your home in Nuvik and you're heating your home downtown Fort Good Hope, but there's a huge difference. one is exempt and the other one's not. So it will create a lot of frustration, a lot of envy, a lot of tension, and the mental health thermometer just jumped 10 points. So as you can see, there's a lot of valid, good arguments to approaching our federal counterparts, and I just want to know from the minister if that debate or that discussion has happened or will happen on convincing them that we got to design a more Nutrition North programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I actually quite like the approach of thinking of rate of return on taxes paid. And it's not just carbon taxes, it's arguably any other source of revenue that the government gets. What's the rate of return that we give back to our citizenry? So, I mean, yeah, right now, as far as having an individualized program, the Northwest Territories does do that. At the request of the 19th Assembly, we did adjust our carbon tax offset payments to being based upon 3 different regions, including the highest paying regions down to less carbon intense reliant regions. So as far as whether or not the federal government would do that, the federal backstop system does not. They, as far as I understand, do a calculation based on a province or territory, well, the province's average carbon tax and then do the rebate based on that. So, but again, as I said, I like to turn my mind a little bit more to how we look at the rate of return and how we communicate that. I do think, in general, that governments should do a better job of explaining to members of the public what we do, because everything we do is with public dollars. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McNeely, do you have a follow-up? No. Mr. Rogers, to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I understand that the exemptions on heating fuel was imposed by the feds, and I understand the reasons why they do that, and I agree with the minister, although we can't be for sure. It certainly was a opportune time to do that. Speaking about backstop versus COLO, has the government, I mean, the COLO, we don't control what the exemptions are, obviously. We don't have that opportunity to do that. From my understanding is we do control the COLO. Has the government looked at adjusting the COLO for these regions that, again, will be overburdened and or won't be able to take advantage of these exemptions to heating oil? Is that something the government is looking at? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, when there was the change that we were able to bring in to exempt heating oil, that certainly did result in there being obviously anyone that's paying that relies on propane or LNG. But we're still looking, so we've reduced the COLO amounts, but we then still were able to look at and ensure that the amounts are still, for the average citizen, going to be more than what they pay in carbon taxes. So, I mean, we can continue to examine whether that continues to bear itself out, whether that continues to be true. And the beauty of COLO right now is that it is in our regulations and doesn't require approval from Ottawa if we were to choose to make further changes to it. But again, my goal that I was given, at least certainly under the previous assembly, and it certainly seems like it's carried forward thus far, is to ensure that citizens' carbon tax burden, so in other words, the amount of tax they pay, not the fuel costs, but the tax they're paying on it, is being, at least on average, returned to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, understood, and I understand that the COLO was done by region, but the fact still remains that in certain regions, some residents will pay 23% more to heat their homes than others after April 1st. And that's why I asked the question, would the COLO then reflect that in those regions? Thank you.
Thank you. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, the COLO was calculated in a way that is meant to take into account the amount of carbon tax that's being paid and not necessarily the cost of fuel in each community. So, I can certainly go back and would endeavor to get it out publicly, the amount that we are anticipating. And it's to anyone who's filed their taxes to just be a bit of a plug for folks to get their taxes filed. But filing their taxes then results in people getting their carbon tax rebate payment back. And it is, again, still meant to, and still anticipated to amply cover and to more than cover the cost of carbon tax for the average resident and the average family in the Northwest Territories. Thanks.
Thank you to the minister. I understand the minister has a prior engagement that she does have to leave for. I'm just going to give the committee an opportunity to ask any quick follow-up questions, one question to each member if they want, but just trying to keep it short. Mr. Hawkins.
Yeah, maybe just by way of sense here that although it's a little bit of history, but it's also where we are too, which is why was a carbon tax taken as a position by the minister and the government versus a cap and trade? That would be most helpful to understand, because I think the way I've read it is cap and trade is more effective in the sense of it set the ceiling and causes people to work with that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. To the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that is going back to the 18th Assembly. That is something that I will have to get back to committee on. I didn't bring that level of history with me to talk about Bill 3. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members that have a quick last question for the minister? Okay. Yeah, I had a question, but I do want to give the minister the opportunity to leave if she needs to, so I'll leave that one. I did want to make one comment, and that was just as the chair of the committee, the minister had mentioned cost to industry. Unfortunately, we have not yet heard from industry or any other witnesses yet on this, so I would just kind of, when I have a public platform in order to do so, I would kind of urge the public, if you do have comments on this bill, you have until, I believe, April 26th. Is that the date? April 26th to submit written comments on the bill, and we'd love to hear from you. That definitely helps the committee make stronger decisions when we hear from witnesses and they share their thoughts on the bill. So I'd like to thank the minister for taking the time today, and yeah, I'll give her the chance to pack up here. And while the minister's packing up, is there any member of the public who is here today to speak to committee and hasn't had a chance to speak yet? Could you please identify yourself, if so? Okay, not seeing any. I think what we'll do then, oh, sorry. Okay, we do have one. So what I'm going to say is we've been going for 2 hours now without a break, so I'd like to give the committee a bit of a break. So if we could take a break until 4 o'clock sharp, we will then hear from the next witness. Thank you. Okay, folks, I am calling the meeting back to order. I believe that our witness, sorry? Yes. And I'm going to call on the public. Is there anyone from the public who would like to present before committee? I think we've convinced the member of the public, so I'm going to give Ms. Sock a second to prepare herself. You ready to go? Okay. Thank you. I'm going to turn the floor over to, I believe, Nicole Sock, who is a member of the public who wanted to share some comments with committee. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. So for those of you who don't know, I also ran in the election. So I knocked on a lot of doors, and I also received a lot of feedback. Mostly that feedback was an overall dislike of the carbon tax as it relates to our current northern predicament, in the sense that we don't have the ability to necessarily switch over to greener options, and that we are so heavily reliant on transportation and infrastructure and carbon-intensive forms of heat and so forth. Generally speaking, people acknowledge that it was a federal program that we were basically just manning the ship of, right? And so everything that was said to me wasn't in regards to what is the GNWT doing, and we don't like what the GNWT is doing. It was just an overall comment about the carbon tax in general, and how they, if anything, wished our GNWT would probably be a little bit more vocal, at least maybe publicly, in their pushback with the feds on how disproportionate it was for us. When Elizabeth May came up years ago, I attended her meeting at NUP. And so being the leader of the Green Party, I was surprised when she acknowledged that their platform that they had for 2030 and reducing carbon emissions and everything else wasn't nuanced enough for us. It wasn't something that was going to work for us. She even had a plan for ICE vehicles and seeing them off the road, but then turning around and acknowledging, but you would be exempt. So when the leader of the Green Party can see these things and then rolls out in their platform a policy that was more carrot first for a longer time, and then the stick, which was the tax, than what our current federal government has chosen to do. Well, there's a reason why our Prime Minister was recently on CBC News radio discussing the dumpster fire that is their carbon tax policy. How you feel about that, it's up to you. There are two things that I see here that are issues. Policy-wise, first issue is that this isn't a living document. Our carbon tax had that leg. We all noticed. It did, unfortunately, coincide with an election. It did take that much longer to be in step with them, but that was glaringly obvious to everyone. So that is in itself something that needs to be addressed. And that can be done without taking a hammer to the whole thing and starting all over. There are amendments and legislative tools that can be put in place to turn what is our current carbon tax bill into essentially a living document. So when something happens federally, it automatically triggers the same thing territorially within our own. We have the ability to do that. I'm pretty sure that there's nothing legally stopping us from changing those policies. The second part of that was, and we've even seen it in this room, was the rebates and how regions wanted to see it dispersed. But I don't see how federally that'll be any better. Recently, actually, I was reading an Auditor General's report. I can't speak today. And this is just a screenshot, so I'm so sorry I can't. So we've already discussed how some of that money federally doesn't actually go back to the territories and to the provinces. They keep it for their own programs. Thank you. So I'm just going to read a portion of this. For the 2019-2020 fiscal year, the department told us that $7 million of the fuel charge proceeds were returned through existing federal government programming delivered by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, Indigenous Services Canada, and Natural Resources Canada to support Indigenous communities. This amount represented 0.33% of total fuel charge proceeds. or approximately 3% of the total allocated to federal programming. So this report is acknowledging the fact that federal programming exists for the carbon tax. So it's very clear that by defaulting to whatever the federal government would put in place, if we were to repeal this, we're not going to see all of that money. There is going to be a portion that goes into these programs. They've laid that out. And from this, 7 million was all they can muster for Indigenous communities. Yet, in the same report, they also mention this finding matters because carbon pricing systems have the potential to disproportionately affect certain groups, such as low-income households, northern and remote communities, and Indigenous peoples. For example, living in remote communities generally requires more travel and options to switch to low-carbon forms of travel, such as buses or electric vehicles. So, the Office of the Auditor General has put out a report that states that what the federal pan-Canadian approach, as it's listed here, would do would not help us the way we need it. So that's the policy reasons as to why I'm very hesitant of repealing any part of our Carbon Tax Act and letting the feds handle the money. Second part of that is, if we're letting the feds, hypothetically, we do. If we let the feds handle the money, while the CRA is collecting that, what's their cut? Are they going to work for free? Or are they going to charge us an administration rate? If so, how much? Do you know? Shouldn't we know? Will it be anything? I don't like jumping into things blindly, and there's far too many unknowns to go, you know what, let's just give it back to them. That's also an emotional response. It's not a logic-based analysis of the situation. It's an emotional response. Oh, well, we didn't want it anyway, so just you do it. That's an emotionally charged response to a problem that you don't want to have responsibility over. The reality is, though, the federal government has been centralizing power in things that they have no jurisdiction over. Daycare, having their say on how money gets spent for healthcare. This is actually one thing where it is their jurisdiction. The Supreme Court has said so. And yet they're offering us the opportunity to figure it out for ourselves. And we took that opportunity in the 18th Assembly. Now, we've spoken policy-wise, but I just want to speak quickly into the politics of this. Politically speaking, the card I see is you're giving them the card. It says, you know what, just you do it. And that card is, I don't have to ask you later or give you the opportunity later to have say, input, control over things that aren't in your jurisdiction. Because I did that once and you didn't want it. That's effectively a card we're handing them, whether or not we want to realize that or not, whether or not the federal government chooses to accept that card or not, that is the card that they get. And we no longer have the say into if they use that or when they use it down the road. And it could be really nice to have them turn around and say, you know what, you actually took responsibility. You did the thing that you didn't like and you handled it well. Here's more input. Here's more responsibility on something that we're downloading onto you. I would rather us essentially suffer through the thing that we don't like, we don't want, than to go, forget this, you deal with it. Because You know, we've come out of devolution, and you hear constantly how the federal government doesn't know what's in our best interest. People in Ottawa are so removed for us. They don't understand our way of life up here. So then why are we turning around and going, you know what? You deal with this thing. And we'll just hope for the best that you'll listen to us and maybe work it out for our benefits better than we could do it for ourselves. And I think that's the wrong approach when we're discussing something that we're ultimately stuck with until perhaps a change in wind occurs at the federal level and maybe a different party comes in and has more carbs out or kicks the whole thing to the curb or whatever the case may be. But I do think there are other ways around dealing with the issues for our current carbon tax system that we all see than approving and passing a repeal act that will essentially kick this can back to the feds. And we just hope on a prayer that it goes the way we want it to. I don't think that is the best use of hope when we're talking about leadership. So that's really all I have to say on that matter.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sock. Are there any questions from committee members for the witness? Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words here today. It's very helpful in the sense of our discussion. It's always nice to have someone from the public have a point of view rather than maybe in the public context. I mean, most of us get most of our screws turned very tightly, whether at the gas station or, you know, at the grocery store or wherever, you know, in the sense of that's where you get certainly hear an earful or perspectives from the public. So I appreciate you coming here today. And the other thing I'll acknowledge is sometimes it's nerve-wracking sitting at the table, and you did great. So don't worry about that. So I'll give you I have a question. I don't think I have too many questions, and I always like witnesses, and I treat them nicely. Government's on their own, but they're tough. But in the most courteous sense, I'd like to ask you a question on, you had some, you framed around carbon tax and process in the federal government and how, who should do it best and whatnot. And I'm just curious if you had an opinion with respect to the federal government did the initial carve-out based on political reasons for a region in Canada, no more, no less important than Northern Canada. In other words, Canadian is a Canadian in my view. Then it was spread throughout Canada, that option. But Canadians heat their homes, not just with one source, such as diesel or home heating fuel. Some do it by electricity, some do it through propane, others do it through natural gas. Not to mention there's things like wood and biodiesel, and there's more. But the Government of Canada has picked one winner on the table, which is if you heat your home by diesel. How do you feel about the issue from your perspective as a citizen that they pick one winner over the other potential options?
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Over to Ms. Sock.
I could say a whole lot about that. The question is how much. Look, I don't think it's any, it's not new information. It's not a secret that Atlantic Canada holds a lot of Liberal seats. So when you have a lot of members of your caucus that are generally upset and getting nothing but earfuls from their constituents, and you've got quite a few of those, and you're tanking in the polls federally, I can see it's hard to see it for anything other than a political play. Look, at the carbon tax is something that is actually meant for somebody like me. since 2020, we went from heating our home with oil to just installing propane. For 4 years, I ran my 2,700 square foot home on nothing but a pellet stove. And I can tell you, because of my house wasn't always 2,700 square feet, we went through a massive renovation, and unfortunately during that time of renovations, we had to do a lot of energy efficiency upgrades that we weren't exactly expecting or planning to do either, but to meet the new building codes. So actually that goes to a point the minister was making. They're not sure where some of these things come from. Well, if you have an extensive enough renovation on your home, you've got to do some energy efficiency upgrades as well. So I think that could also play a factor into that. Because of those energy upgrades, you know, going from doubling my square footage of my home, my heating bill is $500 more annually now than it was in 2019 when I started. And that doesn't factor in the fact, you know, it's not taking away inflation. It's not taking away the carbon tax, because, you know, now we are doing a mix of both propane and pellets now that we have a propane system. But that tax was designed for somebody like me, because my home is now as efficient as it can be. The federal government says the only thing I could do to make my home more efficient is to put solar on it. But I understand that I am part of a minuscule portion of our population. Majority of Northerners can't. And it's costly. It's substantially costly. It held back our renovations in other ways because of that. The federal government did have a program, and they did eventually start this. That, like I said, was more carrot, where we were talking about the energy efficiency programs and everything else that the feds had in place, except they took so long training their energy auditors and getting them enough energy auditors across the country. And that program was really short. So the carrot was really short. The opportunities to take advantage of credits and fundings to increase your energy standards on your home was disproportionate to what we're paying here for taxes. Now going back to what you said, is it unfortunate that the federal government has made the decision that they did? Yes. Is it representative of how vast our country is? No. Is it representative of all of the ways that you can heat your fuel? No. You know, Montreal's sitting there talking about wood-burning ovens for their pizzerias and the carbon emissions from that. There seems to be no solution that is welcome enough. You know, even biomass, well, where's that coming from? It's coming from trees. And just, there's never one right solution. But I don't really know what else to say to that, other than to say, yeah, I do think it's a political ploy. And I do wish that our government was a little bit more vocal. I know our premier right out the gate made a comment, but it's been pretty quiet since. But I don't think what's happened federally is any excuse to kick the can back to them. In fact, I think it's all the more reason not to.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, did you have a follow-up question?
Just one more, and thank you for that. Yeah, I too am very frustrated that our political system doesn't warrant more robust energy when it comes to advocating for Northerners and Northern issues. We often hear, we don't want to spend all our political capital. It makes it sound like we're all sharing $1 for 4 years around the table. We got to figure out how we're going to buy one stick of gum and spread it. Like it just, that's how it honestly feels most days. You did talk about your opposition, you know, in the sense of Bill 3 in the context of how you framed it. So I won't go through that. But what I will do is ask you, how do you see, I guess maybe as specific as you could, that is, in all fairness, how would you see, what specific amendments would you suggest, either to the current system we have, or, well, to the current system we have that could create improvements that you're shooting for? Nope, I gotta go through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Ms. Sock.
So I did touch on that earlier, but I'll repeat it because it's important that that doesn't get lost in the conversation. Like I said, as far as I know legally, I don't think there's anything that's stopping Assembly from doing this, but an amendment could be put forth on the current carbon tax legislation that basically just says, when XYZ happens federally, it automatically triggers the same thing happening here. So it doesn't matter if session isn't happening, if we're in the middle of elections, or, you know, whatever circumstance there might be that would cause a delay. When the feds go, you know, we're carving out this for July 1st, ours will follow suit. That can be an amendment, as far as I know. And nothing I've read on been able to find online has really proven to say otherwise, because that would be something that would have to go through and be approved. So if you're approving the amendment, then you're approving the fact that you know what could be coming. The other one is, you know, like maybe, I know reports go out annually, but as going forward, if the carbon tax gets greater and greater, and as the needs change, you know, diamond mines close and things like that happen, being able to redistribute funding as the needs change is another minor amendment that could be made. Pick your timeline, you know, every couple years, every 4 years. You know, that's a simple amendment as well. Probably a headache for the department, but it's just a minor amendment to what's already there versus taking a sledgehammer to the thing and restarting with no real guarantee how that's going to look. As I've pointed out, there are questions that have yet to be answered when it comes to choose to repeal the act and what happens. So there are other ways, simple ones, but there are other ways.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, I see a question from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick comment and a question, and I'll ask for an opinion, but thank you for coming out. We certainly appreciate that. I know you had been burning pellets, and now you're burning pellets and propane, and you've probably heard during the last two presentations in Inuvik, we've had businesses that ran pellets and then gas as a backup because it was more cost efficient, and then the pellets became too expensive, so now they were running gas, and now I have one business who are switching back to diesel, so we've kind of come full circle back to the dirtiest of the fuels up there to run it. You sound like someone who's certainly familiar with different options for energy efficiency in your home. How do you feel, I'll get your opinion I guess, how do you feel on where we can't do anything with the current exemption, that they're doing an exemption on diesel and that's all they're exempting? How do you feel about the COLO being adjusted for different regions? Granted, you may not be familiar with some of the smaller communities, you may or may not be, but how do you feel about if the GNWT were to take that upon themselves to look at that COLO, given that some people are now paying 23% more if they're burning LNG or propane?
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. And just for context, COLO stands for Cost of Living Offset, which you may or may not know. Ms. Sock.
I'm not well versed. I'll be upfront about that. In how relationally the COLO varies per community, I honestly don't know. To be quite honest, I don't even know if I'm getting it. You raised an interesting point and this goes back to what you said federally. We followed suit, and that's great for one. We can't do anything without getting our hands slapped federally by trying to do the same for any other fuel source. And that, unfortunately, is the reality of the situation when the rules of the game and the parameters of the game are dictated by the federal government. Should that I'd like to see the numbers for the colos, for the regional distribution. I'm sure it impacts them. Should it impact them drastically that much? No. But how do you minimize that blow when now your funding pot is lowered as well? That one's hard without, that one is tricky. It's not clear cut. It's not black and white. It's messy, messy gray. Absolutely. In that regard, the federal system would be easier. But then you're still dealing with this, with people getting colo payments while being exempt from their carbon tax on their heating sources. So that one doesn't really change much difference. Yeah, I really don't know how to answer that without saying the numbers. But I do feel for you because that's not easy.
Thank you, Ms. Sauk. Do you have a follow-up, Mr. Rogers? Any questions, any further questions for the witness from committee? Seeing none. Thank you very much for your submission, Ms. Sauk. I would note that making a verbal submission does not in any way preclude you from still submitting written comments, so I would encourage you to do so if you'd like to. And thank you for speaking before committee today. With that, I believe that concludes the public portion of this meeting. So I would like to very politely and respectfully ask Mr. Williams to leave.